I think so. I think there should be hopefully something which we can demonstrate and be. And someone once said, if you were taken to court on the charge of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? So I hope there is something which is measurable and can be demonstrated, that there's evidence about, despite our weakness, despite our failings, we are trying to live out a Christian life. And this is what we would point to as being the steps or the decisions or the choices we've made to reflect that.
Alex, thanks again for meeting with me. We're continuing our discussion on this wonderful and important subject of discipleship. So our group of conversations here, we're having 4 conversations in total, is being real about discipleship. And in this second conversation, we're going to think about what it means to follow Jesus, thinking about following Jesus. So my first question, Alex, and I think you can help me with this, is when someone recognises Jesus for who he is and determines to follow him faithfully, what actually happens and what changes?
Okay, wow, that's a wonderful question. I think what happens is that there is this wonderful exchange which takes place, that Jesus takes away our sin and gives to us his righteousness and the peace which follows that. So we often explore that in terms of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus coming into our lives and bringing change and transformation. Most Christians would describe that using the words Jesus used when he spoke to a Jewish leader called Nicodemus. It's about being born again, this new birth. It's as dramatic and as transformative as birth. This is a spiritual rebirth. And I think that's a very, very helpful way of expressing it. So we move from darkness into light, from a sense of being condemned and separate from God to belonging to God and being forgiven. So in one sense, everything changes. And I know on these podcasts, there's been some really helpful teaching and discussions about being born again and what that means. So if you're listening to me, you want to do a bit more work, there's some other podcasts which will help you explore that. But what happens for me, I would say someone is reborn. There's that new birth of the Spirit. So at one level, absolutely everything changes. You couldn't imagine anything being more significant in terms of change and transformation than someone becoming a follower of Jesus. It's huge. It's radical. It's wonderful. But there's also a little pushback. At the same point, nothing changes. The moment you give your life to Christ, you still remain yourself. You probably are still in all the relationships you were in before. You're living in the same place. The struggles and joys of your life remain the same. You remain you. And I think that's one of the wonderful challenges about being a Christian. And this is where discipleship really comes in. At one sense, there is the reality of everything changes, but I'm still walking and trying to work out life here on earth. And I'm still tied into who I am. And I think there's that tension, and many of the early disciples of Jesus and the early Christian teachers talked about that, the kind of the what changes and what doesn't change. So I want to say what changes, everything changes, but there's also a little bit of pushback. Nothing changes.
That's a good way of putting it. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, it is a wonderful transformational thing. It is new. It is new life. Yes. It is being reborn.
Yes.
But nevertheless, there is this continuity with our past and with our relationships. And then I suppose, Alex, it leads naturally then into this idea of disciple. How do you define disciple?
Yeah, well, as I said in an earlier conversation, I think discipleship really sums up so much of the teaching of Jesus. He's demonstrating and living the kingdom. The kingdom is the message, but the way we respond is discipleship. So when I dig down into what Jesus means by discipleship, I think it's about a relationship with him primarily. And there's two elements to that relationship. The first is a disciple is someone who is committed to learning from Jesus. So I think discipleship always has a kind of teacher-student relationship. We're learning from teacher Jesus. We're learning from him. But also there's a commitment to becoming more like him. So there's that personal journey of growth and transformation. So I'm not just gaining information about Jesus or learning about the values of the kingdom, although those are really important, but I've also, as a disciple, want to be more like Jesus. So hopefully over a period of time, despite my struggles and failings, people have a glimpse of how I've changed, and hopefully, it's for others to say, but hopefully they say, yeah, there's some Jesus values, there's some Jesus stuff in that, which I hope is true. So a disciple learns from Jesus in order to be more like Jesus.
Thank you, Alex. That's very clear. So, in fact, our life does, in that sense, change, and hopefully, there should be this sense that other people perhaps, will notice a change in our lives. So, discipleship is going to become perhaps increasingly obvious as our life changes, as our nature changes. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think there should be hopefully something which we can demonstrate and be. And someone once said, if you were taken to court on the charge of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? So I hope there is something which is measurable and can be demonstrated, that there's evidence about, despite our weakness, despite our failings, we are trying to live out a Christian life. And this is what we would point to as being the steps or the decisions or the choices we've made to reflect that.
Very briefly, Alex, disciple, discipline, they come from the same root.
Yes.
Would you like to make a comment on that?
Yeah, and because I think this idea of a disciple as someone who learns, you're learning because there is that sense of authority. You're not just sort of picking and mixing, or Jesus may have said some nice things or some challenging things, but there's also a sense of saying, I'm coming under his lordship in order to learn. So I'm inviting, as a Christian, I'm welcoming the discipline of what God does in my life. It's not always easy, but I'm choosing to live under that lordship of Christ.
And within that discipline, there's also freedom.
Yeah, there's I think so much as we look at discipleship, there are these sort of two sides of the same coin. That there is becoming a Christian is, as we said, everything changes, but at the same level, nothing changes. I'm still me. I follow a rule of living. There's a discipline in being a Christian, but there's also an incredible freedom. And I'm in this world, but I'm not of it, and all that kind of stuff. There's these two sides, and I think that's what makes Christian living so rich, and discipleship so important, to hold those things in a faithful, creative tension.
Yeah. And perhaps especially this idea of freedom in the sense of being released perhaps from things that had gripped us in the past that were not necessarily healthy or helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, every Christian's journey is different, but I think there will be this common theme that Christians would talk about of being forgiven, being released from guilt and fear, or even released from a sense of kind of randomness of life. There was a sense of purpose as we become a Christian. So yes, there is that things we're set free from, and there's a freedom we enter into, but it's also a freedom which comes through choices and discipline, as the Lord kind of nudges us and leads us in different ways.
Wonderful. Okay, Alex, we haven't had any scripture, just a very brief verse from John chapter 15 and verse 8. And this is Jesus speaking. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. Would you like to just briefly comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually the verse which I use as a sort of dedication in the book on discipleship, because I think for me that's one of the most wonderful verses about discipleship. Because I think, as we were saying, discipleship should be measurable. There should be evidence. In other words, in the words of Jesus, it should be fruitful. We can see creativity, we can see things being produced in the life of a Christian, both individually and as a community, that there's good things happening. But I think it's interesting that Jesus is saying here, this is to God's glory. That sometimes we think, if we achieve things as Christians or whatever, we kind of think, we take the credit for that. It's part of our journey. But it's at the heart of discipleship is not about us. It's about giving God the glory. And there's a fruitfulness in those lives which are God-centered. And again, I think for some of our podcast listeners, this idea of fruitfulness might not be an easy concept. But if you dig a little bit deeper into the New Testament, one of the early church writers, a guy called Paul, talks about the fruit of the Spirit. And there's a lovely things there. I mean, love, joy, peace, faithfulness, humility, self-control. And I think these are the kind of fruitfulness which Jesus is talking about. It's these qualities that as we live our lives, we give God the glory by the way in which we express love, joy, peace in our lives. So I think these are kind of spiritual qualities which we refer to as fruitfulness.
And hopefully qualities then, Alex, that other people may perceive as well.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope there is that sense in which the Christian life is good news. It's good news for society. Society benefits by Christian living and Christian values, and individuals see something in us, despite our flaws and our brokenness, or maybe because of our flaws and our brokenness. They see a glimpse of God at work, and that can help people explore the Christian message for themselves. Because I think a lot of people who become Christians in their testimony would say, one of the things that helped me on my journey was I had a Christian friend I respected, or I saw in a colleague the way they coped with a bereavement or a disappointment in their life. Yeah. They had a kind of strength which I didn't have, and they claimed that came from their relationship with Jesus.
Yes. Well, thank you, Alex. Again, I think this is probably a good point to draw this part of our discussion to a conclusion. Thank you for that. Thinking about Jesus, what a wonderful subject.
Thank you, Peter.
Bless you. Thank you.